Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining me as we share the enormous privilege of studying together the book known as the Gospel of Mark. Today we come to chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, which read, "Once again Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked Jesus' disciples, 'Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?' On hearing this, Jesus said to them, 'It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" Now, if you've been following these studies, you will know that Mark, who wrote this book, was a friend of both Peter and Paul, the two great founders of the Christian movement. As a result, he shares with us his own experiences and that of some of the other eyewitnesses of the life of the man we know as Jesus. In fact, as we've already seen, this book is all about Jesus. Thus, if we ourselves want to know something more about him, there's simply no better place to start. The fact that Mark tells us that his book is good news might encourage us to read further. After all, in an often depressing world, we welcome something to lighten our spirits. But as we now know, Mark immediately makes some quite extraordinary claims about Jesus. He tells us that Jesus is the great and final prophet who had been foretold for many centuries beforehand, and then he says that Jesus is God in human flesh, or God incarnate. At this point, then, we might be inclined to close Mark's book and dismiss his claims as those of a mad person. However, having made these claims, Mark indicates that his aim is to offer the evidence for them. Claims he knows are, if they're not true, absolutely ridiculous. It is then as though he says, "I know that what I'm saying sounds absurd, absolutely ridiculous, but at least give me a fair hearing by hearing me out." And I think that we should, if only because we expect others to listen to us when we speak to them. Now, as the first chapter ended, Jesus claimed he had the authority to meet humanity's deepest needs, and supported this claim by healing a man suffering from incurable leprosy. In the previous section, chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, Jesus became more specific. He can deal with the universal problem of sin because he is God. After all, only God can forgive sins committed against God. Once again, Jesus backed up his claim with the healing of a paralyzed man. So we come to the second half of this second chapter of Mark's Gospel, where we're introduced to three incidents in Jesus' early ministry. Mark does not suggest that they all happened at the same time. What he does, however, is bring together three stories that involve debates between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day. Today, we're looking at the first of these three stories. As we've already seen, Jesus expected opposition to come from these people, but in these stories we begin to understand why Jesus, who was himself viewed as a religious leader, came into conflict with those who claimed to be the religious authorities of his day, and might therefore have been expected to welcome him. The first story introduces us to Levi, or as he is better known to us, Matthew. Now, Matthew was a man who became one of Jesus' most faithful followers and wrote one of the accounts of his life, the book we know as Matthew's Gospel. And Matthew, we're told, was an immensely wealthy and important person. He was a senior official in the local tax office. Thus he was a member of that group in society that have been almost universally hated, those lacking decency and quick to oppress the poor in order to build up their own fortune. We do not need to look far around us today to meet their modern equivalents. But in Matthew's own society, this also meant that he was treated as a social and religious outcast, and would have been expelled and then excluded from all the centres of religious life, the synagogues or the temples of his day. He would also have been hated as someone who had compromised with the powers, who had occupied and oppressed his country, and who had then taken advantage of his own people in siding with the enemy. Few people would have been as unpopular as he was in the local community, and frankly with plenty of justification. Yet, as Jesus has already done with Peter, Andrew, James and John, he invited Matthew, of all people, to join his group of followers. Briefly, we should notice that it's remarkable that Matthew responded as he did. The earlier disciples, all local fishermen, could always return to their former business, but not Matthew. Having resigned his well-paid job, there was simply no way back. However, Mark's interest in telling this story does not lie so much in Matthew's response to Jesus, as in the discussion that follows between Jesus and the religious authorities. Understandably, Matthew invited his friends to meet Jesus. We don't need much imagination to realise the sort of people that would have been his chums. In fact, the religious leaders leave us in no doubt. They were, as they are described here, tax collectors and sinners, and we can almost hear the sneer in their voices. In other words, Matthew and his friends were, in their view, excellent examples of the sort of people for whom religion is not designed. Surely religion, after all, is for those who are thought to be, or claim to be, good. This could never be said of Matthew and his associates. In fact, in Jesus' day, those described here as the scribes of the Pharisees were widely admired, if not loved, for their commitment to what they believed was a holy life. Their modern equivalents can often be seen today. Jesus' objectors are described here as scribes or writers, and this is roughly equivalent to our word student. They're also identified as members of the Pharisees. We might describe them as the ultra-Orthodox Jews of their day. Thus they were devoted to the study of the laws of their holy books and to scrupulous observance of them. In following these laws and their interpretation of them, they believed they could live a holy life and win the approval of God. We can then understand their difficulties with Jesus, and we may actually sympathize with them. If religion is about living a holy life, and that to do so requires careful avoidance of everything that is bad or contaminated, we can understand their question. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Or put another way, why does he mix with the wrong sort, those who are bound to contaminate him? Jesus' brief reply is the crux of his narrative, and it's mind-blowing. He says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now his response is so awesome that I would like to repeat it before trying to explain it. So again, Jesus says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Can I suggest to you that with these two sentences, Jesus turns both the Pharisees and our own understanding of religion upside down? In the previous story, Jesus suggested that the fundamental problem of the human race is that we all stand shamefully guilty before God. This problem is shared by everyone without exception. Simply, in the language of the Bible, all are sinners. And Jesus also claimed the divine prerogative of being able to forgive our sins. However, the scribes of the Pharisees, for all their knowledge, had not understood this very simple point. They believed that they were there was a sort of exception clause to sin's universality, and that exception was themselves. Sin for them, as for many religious people, was a list of do's and don'ts, and if faithfully observed, they could find their way home to God through their own efforts that could make them holy, righteous, and acceptable to God. This belief was, of course, accompanied by the conviction that if others did not make the same effort that they were making, they had to be avoided, as they might drag themselves, that's the Pharisees, down to the level of sinners. Jesus, however, is teaching a very different message, and fundamental to both his teaching and indeed the teaching of the Bible throughout all its pages is a very different understanding of sin. For the Pharisees, sin was essentially something we do or fail to do. For Jesus, sin is a deep-seated disease that infects all that we are and requires a spiritual doctor, radical surgery, not mere tinkering with lists of correct or incorrect actions. This is why, of course, Jesus introduces himself as a surgeon. More than that, as the surgeon. So Jesus teaches there can be no relationship with God for those who do not recognize their own deep-seated need. The need to recognize that they too are sinners in need of divine forgiveness. Indeed, Jesus seems to be saying that self-righteousness, Jesus' use of the word righteous here appears to be ironic, self-righteousness blinds people to their own need. If we're to understand Jesus and his life's work, then we need to understand this and recognize that he is offering himself as the answer to our needs, not religion. Can I repeat that? Jesus is offering himself as the answer to our needs, not religion. Now, most people who heard the teaching of the Pharisees and who listen to the leaders of most religions today inevitably feel condemned. The standards set by those who regard themselves as holy are such that we feel humiliated and hopeless. However, Jesus' teaching is very, very different. He comes to address those who, like Matthew and his friends, are only too aware that they're in a mess and need outside help to sort them out. This is why Jesus here uses an illustration drawn from the medical profession. Those who are sick, in this case spiritually sick, need a doctor. They're not able to resort to self-help. They need someone to heal them. As I draw this study to an end, I would like to make two final points. The first is that Jesus' words make it very clear that no one is beyond the help they need to be restored to friendship with God. The teachings of holy men and women inevitably lead us to a sense of helplessness. We can never make it with God. Jesus teaches the opposite. To all those who need spiritual healing, a doctor, he says, is at hand. However, and secondly, he concludes with an astonishing claim. He is himself the doctor. The Pharisees sought to avoid infection by their detailed rules and regulations for holiness. Jesus, however, comes to the infected and is not contaminated by them, but communicates his holiness to them and restores them to the full spiritual health that God requires. And yet such healing comes from God himself as God incarnate. God has taken the initiative to get us out of the mess we find ourselves in. What sort of God is this? Certainly not the God of the Pharisees or their modern successors. How all this is possible will need to await our further studies, but Jesus is slowly but surely showing us why every one of us needs him, why he is indeed the best news ever, and I invite you to join me in my next study, as we will have further opportunity to learn about him and why his story is inextricably intertwined with our own stories, and if we will receive him in a loving embrace.